The German patrol leader raised his fist. 14 men froze behind him in the darkness, boots silent on the frozen Dutch field. He tilted his head, listening. Their faint voices, maybe 30 meters east, near those stacked hay bales by the barn. Careless Allied sentries. He smiled and signaled his squad to advance. They never questioned why enemy soldiers would speak so loudly this close to German lines. They never wondered why the voices never moved. By the time the realization came, it was already too late. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. December 1944. The Netherlands. Winter had turned the farmlands between the Rhine and the Waal into a frozen chessboard, where every move could be your last. The Allied advance into Germany had stalled. Both armies dug in, watching each other across fields of frost and mud, launching patrols every night to probe for weakness, to capture prisoners, to kill before being killed. In this environment, innovation meant survival. Routine meant death. Among the Canadian units holding this sector was a young corporal named Thomas Henley, a farm boy from Saskatchewan who had spent his childhood winters rigging up ingenious contraptions to catch coyotes without spending all night in the cold. Before the war, his neighbors thought he was clever. His officers thought he was odd. But in the killing grounds of the Netherlands, odd ideas started to look like genius. Henley had noticed a pattern. German patrols moved like clockwork, cautious, methodical, trained to listen before advancing. They used sound to navigate the darkness, to locate Allied positions, to decide where to strike. Standard doctrine, smart tactics. But Henley saw something else. He saw a weakness hidden inside that strength. If the Germans trusted their ears, maybe their ears could be turned against them. The idea came to him on a night when his squad was pulled back for rest. He sat in a frozen barn, watching his breath cloud in the candlelight, listening to two privates argue about hockey in low voices that carried farther than they realized. Sound, Henley thought. It moves, it bounces, it tricks you. Growing up, he had learned that coyotes avoided traps they could see, but walked right into traps they could hear. The rustle of bait, the creak of a frozen branch. The sound drew them in. The sound made them confident. The sound made them dead. He spent the next day sketching diagrams in a notebook that smelled like diesel and wet wool. His platoon sergeant, a hard-faced veteran named McKinnon, looked over his shoulder and frowned. "What the hell is this, Henley?" Henley explained. McKinnon listened, still frowning, then walked away without a word. Henley thought that was the end of it. 2 days later, McKinnon came back with a lieutenant and a question. "Can you actually build this thing?" The concept was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Henley wanted to create a sound trap, a system that would redirect human voices from a safe position to a dangerous one, making enemy patrols believe they had found an easy target. The mechanism involved hay bales, wooden frames, metal funnels scavenged from destroyed farm equipment, and lengths of pipe pulled from bombed-out barns. The pipes would carry sound from a concealed position where Allied soldiers whispered and talked, funneling those voices to the hay bales stacked in an open killing zone. To anyone listening from a distance, it would sound like careless sentries chatting near a barn, unaware they were exposed. But there was more. Henley designed the system so the hay bales themselves would create acoustic dead zones, areas where advancing enemy soldiers would lose the sound as they got closer, forcing them to move toward the bales to relocate the voices. By the time they realized the voices were coming from pipes buried in straw, they would be standing in a pre-sighted crossfire zone, caught between two concealed machine gun positions and a mortar team with coordinates already calculated. The lieutenant, a young officer named Carswell who had learned to listen to his NCOs, approved a field test. If it worked, they would deploy it on the next German probe. If it failed, Henley would be the man who wasted time and resources on a stupid farm trick. Carswell made that clear. Henley nodded. He had grown up with that kind of pressure. Farming was all about bets you made in spring that paid off or ruined you in fall. They built the first prototype in a barn 3 kilometers behind the line. Henley worked with 2 engineers from the Royal Canadian Engineers who understood acoustics from bridge demolition work. Sound waves, angles, reflection, absorption. The lead engineer, a former music teacher from Toronto named Lieutenant Walsh, brought an unexpected expertise. He had studied how concert halls shape sound, how architecture could amplify or deaden noise. War had turned that knowledge into something darker. Walsh examined Henley's sketches and made immediate adjustments. The pipe diameter matters, he explained, measuring lengths of salvage metal. Too narrow and the voices will sound tinny, artificial. Too wide and the sound disperses before it reaches the exit point. We need something in between, natural but carrying. They settled on 4-inch diameter pipes, the kind used for water drainage in Dutch farmhouses. Sturdy, common, invisible once buried. The funnels proved more difficult. Henley wanted something that would project sound in a specific direction without creating echoes that might alert experienced listeners. Walsh suggested using battered agricultural equipment, old grain funnels, beaten and irregular, that would scatter some sound while focusing the rest. Perfect is suspicious, Walsh said. We want to sound real, which means imperfect, random, like actual voices in an actual space. They tested different configurations. Pipes buried at varying depths, funnels at different angles. Hay, bale stacked tight, loose, or in combinations. Henley insisted on using winter hay, drier, denser, better at channeling sound without absorbing it. Summer hay would have worked differently, he explained. The moisture content changed everything. Walsh, the music teacher turned combat engineer, found himself learning farming science from a 23-year-old corporal who had never finished high school. The breakthrough came on the third day of testing. They had positioned 2 soldiers in a concealed dugout 30 meters from the hay bales, speaking in conversational tones about nothing important, rations, weather, girlfriends back home. The pipes carried their voices through the frozen ground and up through the hay bales. Walsh and Henley stood 50 meters away, listening. At first, it sounded wrong. Too mechanical, too focused, but then Walsh adjusted the funnel angles, creating slight variations in the sound output, and suddenly it worked. The voices seemed to come from somewhere near the hay bales, but not precisely from them. The effect was subtle, disorienting. You could hear men talking, but pinpointing their exact location required moving closer. That was the trap. That was the kill zone. McKinnon, watching from a distance, walked toward the hay bales to test the effect himself. Halfway there, he stopped, a strange expression on his weathered face. I can hear them clearly, he called back, but I can't tell where they are exactly. It's like they're behind the bales, maybe in the barn. He moved closer. The voices grew clearer, but no more directional. At 10 meters from the bales, he finally understood. Jesus Christ, he said quietly, this is going to work. They ran more tests over the next 2 days, refining the placement, the angles, the type of conversation the hidden soldiers should maintain. Henley created a script, casual phrases, natural pauses, occasional laughter. Nothing tactical, nothing that would sound like a trap. Just tired men being careless, the kind of mistakes soldiers made when they thought they were safe. The final prototype included 3 pipes running from the concealed dugout to 3 different hay bales, creating a triangulated sound field that made the voices seem to move slightly, as if men were shifting positions. This detail, Walsh insisted, was critical. Static sound was suspicious. Slight movement was natural. The Germans needed to believe they were hearing real sentries, not a recording or a trick. Carswell watched the final demonstration and approved immediate deployment. We'll set it up in the western sector, he said. The Germans probe that area every few days. If they follow pattern, we'll have contact within 72 hours. He looked at Henley. You've done good work, Corporal. Now let's see if it kills them. They deployed the trap on a cold, clear night in mid-December, in a field the Germans had probed twice in the past week. Intelligence suggested another patrol was likely. The ground was frozen hard, visibility decent under a half moon. Bad conditions for the Allies. German patrols liked nights like this because they could see movement and hear footsteps on frost. Henley's trap was designed to turn those advantages into a coffin. The setup took 6 hours. Engineers buried the pipes in shallow trenches, covering them with straw and dirt. The connections had to be perfect. Any air leaks would create whistling sounds that would betray the deception. The hay bales were stacked in a loose cluster near a ruined barn, exactly the kind of position a careless squad might use for shelter. The funnels were hidden inside the bales, angled to project sound outward in a 120-degree arc. 30 meters away, concealed in a drainage ditch, 2 Canadian soldiers, Privates Doucette and Lamar, sat with a radio and the script Henley had written. Doucette was from Nova Scotia, a fisherman's son with a voice that carried. Lamar was from Quebec, bilingual, able to add French phrases that would confirm to German listeners that these were Canadian troops. They had rehearsed the script until it sounded natural, unrehearsed. Complaints about the cold, jokes about officers, a brief argument about whether the war would end by Christmas. The kind of conversation that happened in every army, in every war, among men who were tired and scared and trying to stay human. The machine guns were positioned in a shallow trench line 40 meters perpendicular to the hay bales, with overlapping fields of fire that turned the approach to the bales into a fatal funnel. 2 Vickers guns, water-cooled, capable of sustained fire. The crews had pre-sighted their lanes, marking trees and fence posts as reference points. In darkness, they would not aim at targets. They would aim at pre-calculated coordinates and sweep their fire across the killing zone. German bodies would walk into bullets, not the other way around. A mortar crew sat another 50 meters back, tubes angled, rounds ready, a mix of high explosive and illumination shells. The plan was simple. Let the Germans advance into the kill zone. Let them cluster near the hay bales, confused by the voices. Then light them up with illumination rounds and shred them with machine gun fire and high explosive shells. Total time from first shot to silence, 15 to 20 seconds. Not a battle, an execution. Henley was not in the firing line. Carswell had pulled him back to the command post, a frozen cellar 200 meters away, where he could listen on the radio, but not interfere. If this works, Carswell said, you'll do it again. If it fails, I don't want you dead before you can learn from it. Henley understood. Officers thought in terms of assets. He was now an asset, not a soldier. The distinction felt strange. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed in silence broken only by wind and the occasional crack of ice expanding in the cold. Doucette and Lamar continued their scripted conversation in low tones, repeating the same phrases every few minutes, maintaining the illusion of careless sentries. Their breath misted in the freezing air. Their fingers grew numb despite gloves. They could not stamp their feet or move around. Any sound not coming through the pipes would break the deception. So they sat, shivering, talking about nothing, waiting for men to come and die. In the command post, Henley listened to radio reports from forward observers. Movement detected in the eastern tree line. Possible patrol forming up. Estimated strength 12 to 15 men. He felt his stomach tighten. This was it. His idea, his design, about to be tested with human lives as the measure of success or failure. The first test came at 0200 hours. A German patrol, 14 men, crossed into the Canadian sector from the east. Forward observation posts spotted them moving cautiously through a tree line, then across an open field toward the Canadian positions. Standard reconnaissance. They were looking for gaps, weak points, targets for a larger raid. They moved in a staggered line, weapons ready, heads turning, listening. The patrol leader was Feldwebel Ernst Kress, a 32-year-old career soldier from Bavaria who had survived 3 years of Eastern Front combat before transferring west. He was competent, careful, and deeply tired. The war was lost. Every German soldier knew that by December 1944, but surrender was not an option. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. So Kress led patrols into enemy territory, looking for small victories that meant nothing in a larger collapse, knowing that each night might be his last. Then he heard it. Voices, faint but clear, coming from the direction of that barn with the hay bales. Kress raised his fist and his men stopped, a well-trained machine responding to familiar signals. He listened carefully. Canadian accents, low tones, casual conversation, either a sentry post or a forward listening position. Either way, a target. Kress made a tactical assessment. 14 men against maybe 4 or 5 Canadians. Good odds that they attacked fast and withdrew before reinforcements arrived. He had done this before. Quick raids, kill or capture, disappear into the darkness. The Eastern Front had taught him speed and violence. The Western Front was slower, more cautious, but the principles remained the same. He signaled his men into two groups, 7 to approach from the left, 7 from the right, a classic pincer to cut off escape routes. His second-in-command, a young Oberstreiter named Vogel, took the right group. Vogel was 19, eager, still believed Germany could turn the war around with new weapons and fresh offensives. Kress did not correct him. Hope, however foolish, kept men fighting. Despair made them careless. The German patrol began its advance, slow and silent, using the frozen ground to mask their footsteps. Kress had trained his men well. They moved like shadows, spacing themselves properly, maintaining visual contact through hand signals, weapons at the ready. Every man knew his role. Every man had done this dozens of times. At 100 meters, they paused again. The voices were still there, slightly louder now. Kress strained to hear details. He caught fragments, something about food being terrible, someone laughing, a comment in French. Definitely Canadians. Definitely careless. He felt a predator's satisfaction. These men were about to pay for their mistakes. At 50 meters, Kress paused again, listening. The voices were clearer now. He could almost distinguish individual words. Complaints about cold rations. Someone laughing. The carelessness annoyed him. These Canadians were going to die because they were too stupid to stay quiet. War punished mistakes like that. Always had. Always would. In the drainage ditch 30 meters behind the hay bales, Doucet and Lamar continued their scripted conversation, unaware that German soldiers were closing in. They could not see the enemy. They could only speak their lines, trust a trap, and wait for the shooting to start. Doucet's hands were shaking, not from cold, but from a knowledge that men were about to die because of words he was speaking. Lamar, older and steadier, kept talking in a low, calm voice, mixing English and French, making it sound natural. The radio operator beside them monitored the forward observer reports, whispering updates. Patrol at 70 meters. Moving in two groups. Still advancing. Doucet felt his heart hammering. He wanted to run, to hide, to be anywhere but here. But he kept talking, kept following the script, because that was his job and men were counting on him. At 30 meters, Kress felt the first flicker of unease. The voices seemed to be coming from hay bales now, which made sense, men sheltering behind cover. But something about it felt wrong. The sound was too steady, too consistent. Real conversations shifted, moved, changed volume as men turned their heads or walked around. These voices stayed fixed, as if the speakers were frozen in place. Kress frowned, slowing his advance. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front by trusting his instincts, and right now his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. But his men were committed now, moving forward in two groups, weapons raised, ready to fire. Pulling back would require complex hand signals, risk exposure, look like hesitation. Kress had seen officers lose respect by being too cautious. Better to push forward, confirm the target, trust your training. He moved ahead, pushing the unease down, focusing on the mission. At 20 meters, Vogel, leading the right group, raised his rifle and aimed at the shadow of the barn. He could hear the voices clearly now. Canadian soldiers talking about hockey, of all things. Idiots. He smiled, finger on the trigger, waiting for Kress to give a signal to fire. Beside him, other German soldiers took aim, selecting targets based on sound. They could not see the Canadians yet, but they would in seconds. Once they opened fire, the element of surprise would carry them through, fast and violent. That was how you won firefights. Kress raised his hand, preparing to give the attack signal. This was the moment, the breath before violence, the pause before chaos. Every soldier knew this feeling, the weight of it, the inevitability. He opened his mouth to shout the command. The signal never came. The machine guns opened up simultaneously, ripping through the frozen air with a sound like the world tearing in half. Tracers lit the field in stuttering red lines, and the German patrol disintegrated. Men screamed, fell, tried to run. The carefully planned formation collapsed into chaos as bullets cut through bodies with mechanical precision. Kress felt impacts hammer his chest before he heard the shots. the physics of violence working faster than human perception. He went down hard, hitting the frozen ground with force that drove the air from his lungs. Around him, his men were dying, torn apart by overlapping fields of fire they never saw coming. Vogel lasted 3 seconds longer than Kress, long enough to understand they had walked into a trap, before a burst from the second Vickers gun cut him in half. The mortar rounds hit 5 seconds after machine guns opened fire. Illumination shells burst overhead, flooding the killing zone with harsh white light that turned night into day. High explosive rounds followed immediately, air bursting above the scattered German survivors, shredding flesh and bone with white-hot shrapnel. Men who had gone to ground, trying to find cover, were torn apart where they lay. The frozen field became a slaughterhouse, lit by the merciless glare of burning magnesium. The Canadian machine gunners adjusted their fire, walking their tracers across the killing zone in methodical sweeps, ensuring nothing lived. They fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, professional and ruthless. This was not combat. This was extermination. 20 seconds after the first shot, silence returned to the field, broken only by the hiss of cooling gun barrels and the soft crackle of burning illumination flares drifting down on parachutes. In the drainage ditch, Doucette and Lamar had stopped talking the moment the shooting started. They sat frozen, listening to men die 30 meters away, their voices still echoing faintly through the pipes buried in the hay bales. The juxtaposition was obscene, casual conversation about hockey overlaid with screams and gunfire. Doucette vomited into the frozen dirt, shoulders heaving. Lamar put a hand on his back, but said nothing. What was there to say? They had done their job. Men were dead because of it. That was war. In the command post, Henley listened to the radio reports. Machine guns firing. Mortars away. Illumination up. Multiple enemy down. No movement detected. All Canadian positions secure. No friendly casualties. Carswell turned to him and nodded once. No words, just acknowledgement. The trap had worked. 14 men were dead. The math was brutal and clear. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire. Henley sat down, hand shaking, staring at nothing. He had known this was a goal, had wanted it to work, but the reality of it, the speed, the finality, the absolute nature of the killing, hit him differently than he expected. Those were men out there, soldiers like him. They had families, histories, reasons for being in that field. And now they were corpses because they trusted their ears, because he had been clever. Carswell saw the look on his face and said quietly, "They would have done the same to us. You gave us the advantage. That's your job." Henley nodded. He understood. Understanding did not make it easier. Outside, the illumination flares burned out one by one, returning the field to darkness. The bodies remained, frozen shapes on frozen ground, silent testimony to the cost of trusting what you hear. The next morning, a Canadian patrol moved forward to assess the site. They found the bodies exactly when machine gunners had reported, clustered near the hay bales, caught in mid-advance, weapons still in hand. No survivors. The patrol leader, a sergeant named Bouchard, examined the hay bales and concealed pipes, then shook his head in something like admiration. "Whoever thought of this is a mean devil," he said. One of his men laughed nervously. Another said nothing, just stared at the dead Germans and thought about how easily it could have been them. The bodies were searched for intelligence, maps, orders, identification papers. Standard procedure. The personal effects, photographs, letters, small tokens, were left on the bodies. No one wanted to touch those. They were too human. Too much a reminder that the enemy was not abstract, not monsters, just men who had made a fatal mistake. Word spread fast. Within 2 days, every Canadian company in the sector knew about the sound trap that had killed an entire German patrol without a single Allied casualty. Officers wanted details. Engineers wanted schematics. Soldiers wanted to know if they could build more. Henley, suddenly famous in a way he had never wanted, found himself pulled into planning meetings, briefings, demonstrations. He was no longer just a corporal with a weird idea. He was a man who had outsmarted the Germans with farm equipment and physics. The attention made him uncomfortable. He had not done this for recognition. He had done it because men were dying and someone needed to try something different. Now those same men looked at him differently, part admiration, part unease, as if he had crossed some invisible line between soldier and something else. But fame in a war zone is a double-edged blade. The Germans had lost 14 men to an unknown weapon, and they wanted answers. Prisoners captured in subsequent raids were questioned about new Allied tactics involving sound. Patrol leaders were warned to be cautious of voices in no man's land, to verify sources before advancing. German intelligence reports began circulating about acoustic decoys used by Canadian forces, possibly involving technical equipment or psychological warfare units. Some reports speculated about recorded voices played through loudspeakers. Others suggested trained actors positioned to lure patrols into ambushes. None of them understood the truth, that it was pipes and hay bales and a farm boy who understood how sound moved through cold air. The Canadians, recognizing the value of the confusion, decided to deploy more traps. Henley trained other teams, teaching them how to set up the pipes, pack the hay, position the decoy speakers. Each installation was slightly different, adapted to the terrain, the expected German approach routes, the available firepower. Some used barns, others used destroyed vehicles or stacked supply crates. The principle remained the same: make the enemy trust their ears, then punish them for it. Over the next 3 weeks, the sound traps accounted for at least 30 more German casualties. Patrols caught in crossfires, mortar strikes, ambushes. The exact number was hard to verify because some German units simply stopped patrolling certain areas, unwilling to risk another massacre. The psychological effect was almost as valuable as a tactical one. German soldiers began to distrust any sound in no man's land, which made them slower, more hesitant, less effective. Fear became a weapon as powerful as bullets, but the traps had limits. They worked best on cautious, methodical patrols that relied on sound to navigate. Against aggressive, fast-moving assaults, they were less effective. Attackers who did not stop to listen could bypass the bait entirely. And once the Germans fully understood the tactic, they adapted. Some patrols began using directional listening devices to verify sound sources before advancing. Others started firing on suspected decoy positions from a distance, hoping to trigger a response that would reveal the real Allied lines. A few particularly aggressive commanders ordered their men to ignore voices entirely, to navigate by sight and map alone, accepting the risk of missing intelligence in exchange for avoiding traps. The evolution was inevitable. Every tactic bred a counter-tactic. Every advantage was temporary. War was an arms race of ideas, and the side that stopped innovating started dying. Henley watched these adaptations with a farmer's pragmatism. Every trick had a counter-trick. The sound traps had worked because they were unexpected. Now that the surprise was gone, their value would diminish. War was like that. Constant evolution, constant adjustment. The side that adapted fastest won. The side that fell in love with old tricks lost. He began working on variations, ways to make the traps less predictable, more dynamic. One idea involved multiple sound sources that could be activated in sequence, creating the illusion of patrol movement. Another used recorded snippets of actual German voices, captured from prisoners, to create confusion about unit identity. Some ideas worked. Others failed. The experimentation continued, driven by the brutal necessity of staying ahead of enemy countermeasures. By January 1945, the Allies were preparing for a major offensive across the Rhine. The static warfare of the winter was ending. The sound traps, designed for defensive ambush scenarios, became less relevant. Mobile warfare required different tactics, different thinking. Henley's role shifted back to regular infantry work, patrolling, scouting, fighting. He did not mind. The fame had been uncomfortable. The responsibility had been heavy. He was glad to be just another soldier again, one face among thousands, doing a job that needed to do it without the weight of innovation on his shoulders. But the legacy of his idea persisted. After the war, Allied intelligence debriefed him about the sound traps, documenting the design and the results for future study. Military engineers analyzed the acoustic principles, considering applications for future conflicts. The concept of using sound to deceive and lure enemy forces became part of the evolving toolkit of psychological and unconventional warfare. The Germans, in their post-war debriefings and historical accounts, rarely mention the sound trap specifically. The winter of 1944 in the Netherlands was a blur of defeats and withdrawals, a slow collapse under overwhelming Allied pressure. Individual tactical failures blended into the larger narrative of loss. But some German veterans, interviewed decades later, remembered nights when voices in the darkness lured patrols into killing zones, when trust became fatal, when nothing was what it seemed. Those memories haunted them, not because of the casualties, which were common in war, but because of the deception, the betrayal of their own senses. It felt like fighting ghosts, one former Feldwebel said in a 1970s interview. You could hear them, but they were not there. How do you fight that? Henley himself returned to Canada in late 1945, went back to his farm in Saskatchewan, and never spoke much about the war. When neighbors asked what he did overseas, he said he was a soldier, nothing special. He did not mention the traps. He did not talk about the 14 Germans who walked into his idea and died. He did not describe the night spent training other teams, the expanding body count, the slow erosion of his certainty that what he'd done was right. Some things were better left in the frozen fields of the Netherlands, buried under snow and time. He married, raised children, worked the land with the same practical ingenuity he had brought to war. His neighbors never knew that the quiet man fixing tractors and planning crop rotations had once designed weapons that killed dozens of enemy soldiers without firing a shot. But occasionally, on cold winter nights when the wind howled across the empty prairie, he would stand outside his barn and listen to ways sound moved through the darkness. How it bent, how it tricked you, how it made you believe things that were not true. And he would think about those German soldiers, moving toward voices that were not real, trusting their senses in a world where trust was a fatal mistake. The war had taught him many things, but the deepest lesson was this. Survival belonged to those who questioned what they heard, who distrusted the obvious, who understood that the enemy's greatest weapon was not firepower but deception. Henley had used that weapon once, with brutal efficiency. He had turned sound into a trap, voices into bait, and human instinct into a killing ground. The Germans ignored his idea when they first encountered it. They assumed the voices were real, the position weak, the opportunity easy. That assumption killed them. By the time other German units learned to be skeptical, the damage was done, not just in casualties, but in confidence. How do you fight an enemy who can make you hear things that are not there? How do you trust your senses when your senses can be weaponized against you? These questions haunted German patrol leaders through the winter of 1944, and they haunted Henley for the rest of his life. Not because he regretted what he had done. He understood the necessity, the logic, the brutal math of war, but because he had glimpsed something uncomfortable about human nature. How easily we're fooled, how quickly we believe what we want to believe, how fatal that belief can be. The Bale sound trap was never a major weapon of the war. It did not change the outcome of battles or shift the course of the campaign, but it was a reminder that innovation in war does not always come from laboratories or generals. Sometimes it comes from a farm boy who understands coyotes in frozen fields, who sees a problem and thinks, what if we use sound the way trappers use bait? Sometimes the most dangerous ideas are the simplest ones, born from experience and necessity, tested in blood and silence. 14 German scouts walked into that trap because they trusted what they heard. They were trained soldiers, experienced, careful, but training could not save them from a weapon they did not know existed, a tactic they had never encountered. In the end, they died because they assumed the world worked a certain way, that voices meant men, that sound meant proximity, that their ears would protect them. Those assumptions were wrong. That wrongness killed them. Henley lived with that knowledge for 60 more years. He farmed, raised children, grew old in a country that forgot most of what happened in the frozen fields of Europe. But he never forgot the sound of those voices, piped through hay bales, drawing men toward death. He never forgot the silence that followed the machine guns, the weight of 14 bodies on frozen ground, the simplicity of the trap and the totality of its success. War, he came to understand, was not about courage or righteousness or even survival. It was about asymmetry, finding the one thing the enemy did not expect, exploiting it before they adapted, then moving on to the next trick. The sound trap was his contribution to that brutal, endless game. It worked once, worked perfectly, and then faded into history, remembered only by the men who built it and the men who died because of it. In his final years, when people asked him what the war was like, Henley would sometimes say it was cold and it was strange, and nothing was ever what it seemed. That was the truest answer he could give. The war had taught him to distrust certainty, to question the obvious, to understand that survival often depended on seeing the lie before it killed you. The Bale sound trap was a lie made lethal. It promised easy targets and delivered death. It turned instinct into a weapon and trust into a trap. And for a few dark weeks in the winter of 1944, it made the Germans afraid to believe their own ears. That fear, more than the casualties, was Henley's real achievement. The creation of doubt in a place where certainty meant life and hesitation meant death. The soldiers who fought alongside him never forgot the man who built voices out of pipes and turned hay bales into graves. Long after the war, at reunions and memorials, they would tell the story of Henley's trap, the way veterans tell stories that matter not as boasts, but as warnings. Never trust what you hear, they would say. The enemy is always smarter than you think, and the simplest traps are the deadliest. Henley himself never told those stories. He carried them quietly, the way farmers carry the weight of seasons, necessary, heavy, part of the work. He had done what needed doing, had used his mind and his skills to kill men who would have killed him. That was a transaction of war, brutal and clear. He did not celebrate it. He did not apologize for it. He simply lived with it, the way he lived with the memory of coyotes caught in traps he built as a boy, struggling and dying because they trusted the sound of bait. In the end, that was a lesson the hay bale sound trap taught, not just the Germans who died, but everyone who learned of it. Trust is a weapon. Sound is a lie. And in war, the most dangerous thing you can do is believe the world is what it seems. Thomas Henley understood that truth better than most, having weaponized it with pipes and hay and the voices of tired men pretending to be careless. He gave the Allies an edge in a war of inches, killed enemy soldiers without wasting bullets, and proved that the deadliest innovations often come from the unlikeliest sources. Then he went home, returned to his fields, and spent the rest of his life listening to wind and silence, carrying the weight of voices that killed and the knowledge that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most terrible. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him.